Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show where we have philosophical discussions and help you develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with the Assyriologist Dr. Joshua Bowen. We speak on his work, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1. There are currently 2 volumes out. We just speak about the first one. If you would like to support Dr. Bowen and his work, please see the description below. And if you find value in what I'm doing, please consider liking, subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast, and of course, sharing the podcast, as it shows your support, and I'd greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Joshua Bowen. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have returning guest, Dr. Josh Bowen. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we kind of talk about today's topic, if you would remind our listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Joshua Bowen. I run a YouTube channel. I mean, really, my wife does more of it, but called Digital Hammurabi. And I have a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Assyriology with a minor in Hebrew Bible and a fair amount of archaeology under my belt. Uh, so I got a master's in theology before that in Old Testament studies, and then at a fairly fundamentalist evangelical school, and then I got my bachelor's in religion from Liberty University, which is, of course, probably the most fundamentalist school. But so my background is in Old Testament and the ancient Near East, and so that's what I talk about. I write books about. Um, yeah, I tend to do a lot of work online addressing bad arguments from Christian apologists. That's sort
Mhm.
of what I do.
Yeah,
So,
and I think that's one of the things that I think is very valuable because it's not like, I mean, everyone has their bias, right? Everyone's coming from certain perspectives or has whatever implicit bias going on. But then it's kind of what you just talked about, where you're trying to clear up some of the stuff that's just, like, not uncommon, but it's kind of one of the things where, um, so something like this, where maybe some people are disagreeing about a particular thing, genocide in the Bible or slavery in
mhm,
the Bible, like that. But then you have probably one party that was saying like, well, you need to read the sources or read what they're actually saying. What does the Hebrew say in there? Or well, what was the narrative behind it? Anyway, context, right? Because that's always what's
mhm,
kind of shifted towards. Then
yeah,
you have one party where it's like, well, it's not really important, is it? But what I like is that the brief overviews and the brief outlines of your work, where it's just like, where I don't have to be like, man, do I really have to go and study ancient, Near
right.
East like history and what's actually going on? Like, do I have to be a scholar in that when you know, so that's what I find very valuable, where it's like reading, it's like, okay, cool, like, yeah, this is what kind of is generally agreed upon. And that's kind of where you
Yeah.
kind of move to, where it's like, hey, look, I'm just reporting consensus here. Um,
Yeah. This is really the difficulty, I think, with anybody that's like an intelligent, interested non specialist. Like, how do you know what's reputable? And I think it can be even more frustrating because there are certain scholars that I would say, and that most other scholars would say, are really, really good in their fields in these other areas. But then when they cross over into this particular area, for example, something like the Exodus, they have theological commitments, and so those theological commitments sort of color their positions. And while they would normally hold to these fundamental, foundational things that all scholars adhere to, as soon as you cross into that other area, now their position gets a little more fringe, or it gets certainly goes into the minority position. And so when you read somebody, you're like, okay, how do I know if in this area they're adhering to what scholars say in general, or if they're going off sort of in their own little position? It's difficult. It's sometimes difficult for people that are actually in the field to know that as well. So it's certainly not just non-specialists, but that's why
Mhm.
in the work that I do, I that's sort of my goal. It's not to break new ground.
Yeah.
It's to be able to bring, what, as you say, what consensus among scholars is, and to try to say, look, here's where to start,
Yeah.
right? This is your foundation on which to build. So
Yeah, and then so kind of just for our listeners, what we're talking about is Josh. He came out with two books actually. The second one just came out not too long ago, I think a couple weeks ago.
Hmm.
But it is the Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. Um, to kind of like what you're saying, kind of just here's like kind of what's just generally accepted, or this is kind of what's really going on, or not really going on, but just general consensus of what's going on in the ancient Near East during that time of the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. I guess that can be kind of interchangeably used. Um,
Yeah, usually Old Testament implies Christianity because it's
mhm.
Old Testament and New Testament. Hebrew Bible is more like a general, a more generic or general term.
Um, but like, so kind of going on with the consensus a little bit, like towards the end of the book or at the end of the book, essentially you have, like here's the sources, you go check them out if you want to learn more about what actually maybe something's going on. And that's what I really definitely appreciated. So yeah, overall I think it's when I read the book, it kind of gives me, and this is the second time I felt this way where I started appreciating, I, so appreciating the Bible in a little bit different way. Um,
Hmm.
so like the first time I felt that was when I read John Dominic Crossan's the Parable, something like I think the Power of
Okay.
Parable, something like that. Anyway, where I think one of his arguments was, or what he's trying to say is that the Old Testament is more I can't even remember his argument, but anyway, it's more of just it's reading in a different way. Where here's example like Luke, the author of Luke, why would we think that he's Greek? And like, look at the way he's writing, he would be this and that, because he's trying to push some type of like agenda in some sense. Very loosely,
Hmm.
I'm using that in a very loose sense. But looking at it that way, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I can see how that makes sense in from a historical perspective, where someone is like trying to convince other people, and this is how they would write or structure the
Hmm.
book. Anyway, in this one, it's kind of the same exact thing where you in the first chapter where you kind of go over the layout of the whole, well, at least some of the books in the Old Testament, and it's just like,
Yeah.
wow, like just from like an outsider's perspective, reading it, and I'm like, well, that's kind of it's a very interesting story about kind of how the series of events,
Yeah.
whether or not they're historically accurate or not. It's just like, wow, this is kind of an interesting what happens, between the
Yeah.
groups of people or the Israelites and how they move about and just the lineage of things. So I find that kind of more appreciative. I'm like, yeah, this is kind of I can see why someone right would want to study this. That's kind of
Yeah.
where
Seth Andrews narrated the audio book of both volumes one and two. And when three comes out, he'll do that one as well. I'm quite sure, but um, that was actually the chapter that he appreciated the most, which I was actually surprised at that. But the reason that he gave, um, he said it publicly several times, that I was really appreciative of it, is that the whole point is when you deal with fundamentalist evangelicals, um, and I was one for 26 years, right? So I feel comfortable saying this. If you ask them like what happened in the past, they will very confidently hold up their Bible and say, this, right? This is what happened. Um, and so when you deal with some of these more difficult issues, like, for example, 1 Samuel 15, with the Saul being commanded to slaughter the Amalekites down to the children and the babies. Um, if an atheist presents that, or a skeptic presents that to a fundamentalist evangelical, the first question that comes back is, well, do you know the context of that story? And the problem, I think, again, and this is just in my experience, is that you don't need to know the context in order to say it's bad to kill innocent people. Um, but for the fundamentalist, um, because they're starting with their conclusion and then backing into the data, um, they're starting believing that God had a morally justified reason to do that. And so, what is that moral? Then they just have to figure out what it is, right? Well, then the story tells them that the Amalekites ambushed Israel on their way out of Egypt, right? So that's the reason, right? They're really, really bad, and so they must still be really bad. And if you don't know that story as the skeptic, then the conversation ends for them, because they said, I mean, but you don't even know who the Amalekites were. I don't even have to deal with this because you don't even know it. So my goal was to try to prepare the reader, the atheist or the agnostic or the skeptic, to engage at that level, which means that you have to know what the story is. So if you can come back and say, "Yeah, I know who the Amalekites were," I mean, do you? Right? Oftentimes they don't actually. Um, but that's what we do. So I took out all the things like, so and so begat so and so and so and so begat so and so, or here are the 7 chapters about how to build the tabernacle and the rings, for the curtains. Like all that stuff is stripped out. It's just what's the narrative, what's the story. So in volume 1, we start at creation and we go through till the death of Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and then in volume 2 we pick it up with the book of Joshua and the conquest, and we go all the way through to the death of Solomon and the
Okay.
end of the united monarchy. And then volume 3 will pick it up with Jeroboam and Rehoboam and the divided monarchy, and that'll go through until I'll probably end it just at the return of the exiles and the rebuilding of the walls, that sort of thing.
Do you find that you'll do like a New Testament as well, or is that not something that Yeah.
That's a good question. So I'm sort of in two minds about it. I, as you know, I'm sure, and anybody that knows me listening, my catchphrase is that's not my area of expertise, right? I feel like I say that like I breathe. But um, so when I think about the New Testament, yes, during my master's at seminary, I had 6 years of Greek, and I translated through like all the really difficult passages and went all the way
Mhm.
through Hebrews and all that stuff. But it's not like I didn't major or minor in it. So I'm always hesitant to do something. But somebody brought up a good point, and that is that um, if I'm just sticking with the more foundational issues in the consensus scholarship, that actually that I'm very, I mean, I feel very like
Mhm.
I know Greek very well, and like
Mhm.
I feel like I'm at least as qualified
Yeah.
or qualified to do that. So maybe is the answer. That was a really long way of saying maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's kind of get into a little bit of the book a little bit. So, in the first chapter, you go over the narrative, and then you kind of go over a little bit more of a history behind the ancient Near East, kind of what was going on at that time. But I kind of feel like more of like the meat and potatoes, I guess, is more with the historical accuracy of the Bible. So, if we want to talk about, or if we can talk about how archaeologists kind of typically compare, or what are they looking at in the book, how can we be confident either that some of the information in the Bible, because is centered around some of what's going on within history, but kind of demarcating it from like what actually transpired.
Yeah. Yeah. So in both volumes, uh, the first chapter is the narrative. The second chapter, I talk, as you say, I talk about the history of the ancient Near East. In volume 1, I do that from the perspective of Mesopotamia. In volume 2, I do it from the perspective of Egypt. So I give sort of an Egyptian history. And again, not my field, but I had several Egyptologists read it once it was done. So I feel good about it. Um, the archaeology uh, in volume 1, chapter 3, I give like an introduction to archaeology in general and say, just here's how it works. This is what they do. And then I give 2 test cases. So how can archaeology inform us on some of these specific issues? One is child sacrifice in like the ancient Near East or in Canaan in particular, and then in Israel, and how you know do we have conflicts between what the Bible says and what we know from archaeology? And then the other is the Philistines. Where did the Philistines come from? When did they arrive? And what can archaeology tell that? And how does it square up with the Bible?
Mhm.
Um, in volume 2, I I go into the archaeology of the period of the conquest under Joshua. So we ask the question like, okay, if 2.5 to 3 million Israelites came up to the Jordan River, crossed over, and I mean, of course, it would have been like 600,000 or whatever, but of the fighting men. But if they went in and conquered in the Negev and conquered in Transjordan and conquered in Cisjordan, what would we see in these cities in the archaeological record? And of course, I am not the first person to talk about this. Eric Klein, who actually has an endorsement blurb on Volume 2, who's an archaeologist and a historian. He wrote a book specifically dealing with that topic, and I just sort of built off of what he wrote. But yeah, it's trying to look at what does the Bible say, and or what does the Old Testament say, or the Hebrew Bible, and does archaeology support it, or at best, um, does it support it? At worst, do we not have evidence that would suggest what the Bible is saying? And in both cases, we run into problems with the biblical narrative. So, like in Volume 1 with child sacrifice, the way the Bible reports um, on child sacrifice in Canaan, it's that in the second millennium, in the first half and in the middle of the second millennium, there's like rampant child sacrifice in Canaan. Well, we just don't have evidence of that in the archaeological record. In fact, the only thing that we have outside of some debated little snippets, and if anybody's interested in this, outside of the chapter section of the chapter that I wrote in the Atheist Handbook, Heath Durrell, who was at Princeton, he's now down at University of Texas, Austin. He wrote his dissertation and then published a monograph on child sacrifice in ancient Israel and discusses all this very, very thoroughly. Also, Francesca Stavrakopoulou has a monograph on that. So I would encourage everybody that's interested in that to read those two volumes. But what we do have comes from the first millennium, and most of it is from, like, in fact, all of it I think is from the 7th century down through the 2nd century BCE. So very, very late when compared to what the Bible says. And we don't actually have evidence from Canaan, right? From, Palestine. Where we have it is from Carthage, which is, off to the west. It's like a Phoenician colony, but so there's a connection to Canaan, um, but it's not directly from Canaan. So at best we can say maybe, right? But we don't have the evidence for that. And it's worse, I think, for the biblical narrative with the Philistines, because we know pretty well where the Philistines came from. And while it's, some of the nuances obviously are still debated, as they always are, there's a group of people right around 1200 BCE that come down from the Aegean region, and they're known as the Sea Peoples. And one of the groups, they come down and they fight against Egypt, and they're sort of pushed back. And there's a group called the Peleset, and the Peleset are the Philistines, and they move back up the coast of the Mediterranean and sort of settle along the coast in Canaan, in the cities like Gath or Gath, and Ashkelon, Ekron, um, and that's the group of people that come into conflict ultimately with the Israelites. So this idea that when the Bible, reports in Genesis that the Philistines are here and the Philistines are doing these things, and it's like, yeah, but they're not there, right? It's way too early for the Philistines to have been there, and that's a problem. And just very quickly, as far as the archaeology of the conquest, the two questions that we ask when I look at 7 different cities, both outside of Canaan proper and inside. And I ask 2 questions, again, modeled off of what Eric Klein did. And I say, was there a city there to be destroyed? And in the archaeological record, do we see a destruction at that time? And we just go to each city. So we go to the city of Arad, then Heshbon, then Dibon, outside of Canaan proper, and then we look at Jericho and Ai and Lachish and Hatzor inside the land, and we just look at the evidence. And, like, what does archaeology tell us? Spoilers. It's not good for the biblical account. So I think, just sort of to wrap that up, I think it's important for someone who holds to a more fundamentalist approach to honestly engage with archaeology in a meaningful way, because if not, y- you're going to find, if at the moment that you do honestly engage, you're going to find that there are lots of problems. And there are more progressive evangelicals, for example, that sort of realize that there are problems, um, and they adjust their positions. Again, I don't agree with the adjustments often, but they have to adjust based on the archaeological data. And a very quick example: somebody like James Hoffmeyer, Kenneth Kitchen. It was understood for 2,000 years, right? That in Exodus 12:37, where it says 600,000 fighting men left Egypt in the Exodus, which would go with women and children up to like 2.5 to 3 million people. Well, y- there were, I think the estimates in the New Kingdom were 3 million people in all of Egypt. So, you can't have the entire population of Egypt leaving Egypt. And so they recognize this, right? So James Hoffmeyer would say, like, yeah, we know now from archaeology and from other, historical investigation, that there's just no way that many people. So we must be mistranslating this word thousand. And I deal with this argument in volume two. Um, but that's the sort of thing that you have to do. You have to say, well, archaeology tells us that that can't be right. So we have to find an answer to that. And that's why I would say I would encourage fundamentalists
Yeah.
to look into these things, because they're
Because that's
things
where
that scholars have been.
you're kind of putting commitment first, or
Yeah.
the commitment first before, and then be like, okay, well, something's kind of going wrong. It kind of reminds me of I think it's Daniel chapter of the book you have on the prophecy of
Mhm.
Daniel, where with Nebuchadnezzar and the translation of Belshazzar, I think that's how you
Mhm.
pronounce his name. But if it's like, but I think in the biblical text you have like, well, that's the son, or Balthazar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar,
That's
and
right.
then you have kind of what you're talking about, a translation, possible translation of, well, grandfather or father, or
Right.
there's something kind of going on there. It kind of reminds me of that a little bit, where something needs to be, is it a wrong translation, or how do we use this word here that because that we're seeing something like that.
Yeah. I mean, just so the audience knows what we're talking about, like in the book of Daniel, you have um, the he's called the king Belshazzar, who is over Babylon at the time, which would have been the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and uh, he's called the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, I mean, we know historically that he's not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Um, he's the son of Nabonidus, who was the actual reigning king at the time. And so apologists will take that and say, well, well, wait a minute, wait a minute. First of all, you didn't even think there was a Belshazzar before, but then, you were proven wrong. So that there must be an answer here as well, an explanation. And so they say, well, in Semitic, right, in Semitic languages like, Akkadian or Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic, um, son can also mean like grandson, and father can also mean grandfather. And so what it's saying is that Nebuchadnezzar was his grandfather. And you say, well, but he wasn't. He wasn't his grandfather either, right? We don't have any of evidence that he's his grandfather. Well, they say, but isn't it possible that, because there's this other Neo-Babylonian king named Neriglissar, and Neriglissar marries the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the daughters, and isn't it possible that Nabonidus also married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar? And yeah, okay, we don't have any evidence of that. Number one. Um, so now what you're having to do is saying, isn't it possible that, and then isn't it also possible that? So you have to have two possibilities. But the problem is, when you had that, you have this commitment, all you need is the possibility. And actually, this is the thread that sort of runs throughout volume two, is how to deal with an apologist that is saying, or really anyone that is saying, well, isn't it possible that? How do you deal with what I call the God's ways argument, right? Like, how is it that God can command the slaughter of these innocent people? Well, God's ways are higher than our ways, right? address that? How do you handle somebody that talks about that? Um, but one of the things that we see in Daniel in this particular case is that it's not just that we're trying to disprove their position, because that's like, this is history. It's not a deductive argument, right? You're not going to get to the point where it's like, if A is true and B is true, then so like there's always going to be slippage, right? A little bit of wiggle room because it's history. However, what we need to do is say, what is the most reasonable model, interpretive model that accounts for the data points? And when you go and investigate the evidence, for example, here we have the prayer of Nabonidus, right? It's something that's found in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, um, and this is a story that is very, very, very similar to the madness story of Nebuchadnezzar, but it's about Nabonidus. And there are other places where Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus get sort of mixed up in the story. And so what's more likely, much more likely, as consensus scholarship would argue, is that Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar, just their traditions getting kind of mixed up. Right. So when it says he's the son of Nebuchadnezzar, it's something that's mixed up, but he's the son of Nabonidus. That's what is going on there. Um, but if so, for somebody that doesn't hold to an inspired, and errant, more fundamentalist approach to the text, that's like, oh, cool. Well, that explains that. No, that makes sense. But for somebody that doesn't, it's, whoa, there can't be anything wrong with the biblical text. So we have to go with the possibility, rather than with that much more likely suggestion of the data.
Yeah, and then it kind of goes in that you're not really doing history anymore, or kind of like the theological commitments are kind of come into play. And that reminds me a little bit of when I went to a private school for my undergrad, um, Fresno Pacific University
Mm.
here in California, and we had to take a class, a biblical history class. I can't remember exactly what the title was, but anyway, it was going over the parable of the prodigal son,
Mhm.
and the my professor, he was giving a different interpretation, but it wasn't like, how do I say his interpretation was? It was based off of other, like, actual, like, not actual, I shouldn't say that, but like scholarly work. That's not
Mhm.
it wasn't just him saying something.
Right.
And one person was really like, well, no, that's wrong, or that's like the wrong interpretation. And I remember his response multiple times was just like, hold on, you're bringing theology into this. Like, we're not talking about that right now, or like
Yeah.
that's something different. This is just, and then he was like, well, this isn't just me saying this. This is from something else, that he's kind of drawing from. And it was a very interesting take. But it had to do with what the writer was trying to convey
Mm.
to the person, or to, like, about the story,
Yeah.
which is different. But okay, but kind of going back a little bit, if you don't mind, kind of going over a little bit for Daniel, going back what, the prophecy, with Daniel, and kind of the book behind that a little bit, and then why we kind of have further reason to doubt. Because then in the book you do, like a linguistic type of data set
Mhm.
that we draw from, and then a historical kind of data, which you kind of went over a little bit of history. But yeah, if you don't mind just kind of summarizing a little bit of that.
Yeah, sure. And I will try to keep this as with as little technical data as possible. I think the example that I like to use when I talk about this, and again, these are if people are interested in this, there are phenomenal works that talk about this, from which I drew. Right, that's what I'm doing, is I'm taking all these scholarly works and trying to distill them down so that you can get an overview of them, and then you can go if you're more interested in digging in. So, for example, I utilize John Collins' commentary on the Book of Daniel in the Hermenia series. But when we if you were to pick up a piece of paper, um, and it looked kind of old and kind of crinkly, and maybe you found it in a library or something, and you opened it up and it said, to be or not to be, or what meanest thou by this? You might say, okay, the paper's kind of old. It's using like this old English. This is probably I could probably get. Certainly, this is older English. It's not from like 10 years ago, right? Um, so like those sorts of dating methods are useful, right? The methodology behind that is, uh, not obviously the paper, that's more difficult, but I mean, looking at how the grammar, the syntax, the words that are used, are they still in use today? You can sort of start to date things based on usage, common usage. Um, However, if you were to read it and it would say, what meanest thou, dude? Right? You would say, wait a second, like, what meanest thou? That sounds pretty old, but dude, I don't think they used dude back then, right? So now you're starting to question, wait a minute, maybe this is somebody writing, trying to make it seem old, but slipping up and putting in a more modern phrase or a more modern, lexeme, a word. And so it's that basic, that's sort of a basic analogy to what it is that scholars do when they look at something like the book of Daniel. So Daniel is considered in scholarly works linguistically late, right? And there are two. The book is written in two languages. It's written in Aramaic and it's written in Hebrew. Most of the first half is written in Aramaic, and then the second half and the first chapter written in Hebrew. Um, and so it's a very complex study, right? Looking at how so that they start, let's say, with the Aramaic, and they say, okay, let's read the Aramaic and let's compare the syntax, the orthography, like the spelling of words, the grammar. Let's compare those things um, to the other groups of Aramaic texts that we know the dates of, and we'll see where does it sort of fall in the spectrum. So we have Aramaic, for example, at Qumran in like the second century, first centuries BCE, and then we have Aramaic that like goes back Sumerian papyri or Elephantine papyri, whatever. Um, so we have these older groups, and then we have a later group, and then we look at Daniel. We say, okay, where does Daniel fit in? And there are certain ways, like the letter D and the letter Z, uh, there's a shift that takes place as time goes by, and you can see it. And so, looking at, okay, which text is using D, which text is using Z, and you can hear, you get, like, if you say Z and D, it's like there's some um, because the D was pronounced more like a the, so you can sort of catch why it is that that shift might take place. But
Mhm.
looking at that, you can see, oh, okay, well, it's shifted here, so this text is probably leaning later, right? And this one hasn't shifted, and so it's probably leaning earlier. But the Aramaic, like, it is suggestive that it is later, but it's not really definitive, right? Nobody, I don't think anybody would say we can definitely date the book of Daniel to the second century because of the Aramaic. I think they would just say it tends to lean later, right? So then they look at the Hebrew, and the Hebrew itself develops, right? So if a modern Hebrew speaker, for example, goes back and looks at the Hebrew Bible, they'll notice things like word order is different. Um, and the way that certain words are used. There are older forms that don't appear in modern Hebrew anymore, so it'd be very easy to distinguish. Right, this is ancient Hebrew and this is modern Hebrew. But the same development takes place, um, and so the Hebrew. Again, looking at the way words are used, for example, there are certain words. Boy, why can't I think of a good one? I mean, everybody uses the example of the word gay, right? Gay used to mean happy, and now it has taken on, as a member of the LGBTQ community. So, like, it very rarely today, at least in my experience, is used as happy, right? So if you had a document that was using the term as a member of the LGBTQ community, be like, okay, well, that's probably later, right? And there are words that do the same thing in Hebrew. So the word um, but I don't have to go into specifics because that would probably be boring. But you can say, well, this word has this. this particular nuance, it has a slightly different meaning. Um, that's a later development, so that it looks like it's leaning later. So the Hebrew is actually more telling. And the way that scholars, sort of would say it is they call it late biblical Hebrew, and they would say it's much closer to the period of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, end of the first millennium, but not quite that late, which works, right? That seems to fit. So that's the more technical, I would say, way to date the book of Daniel. And I guess I should say, just before I continue on, or before we get into the historical stuff, like, what's at stake? Why is it that the date of the book of Daniel is important? Because, like, I don't think anybody would really care outside of people in the field of Assyriology whether the Epic of Gilgamesh was put together in 1200 or 1100. Like, nobody would care, right? It's not like it's a huge theological issue. But it is a theological issue for the dating of the book of Daniel, because if Daniel's written in the 6th century by a guy named Daniel, well, I mean, that's a pretty significant prophecy, right? Like, he's talking about, before these changes take place, which kingdoms are going to come, right? Ending with the kingdom of Greece. And so that's pretty significant, because there was no Greece. I mean, there was Greece, but I mean, like, there was no Greece takeover, Grecian takeover at the time. So that it would be prophesying that Greece would conquer. If it's written in the 2nd century, around like 165, 167, something like that, well, now it's not quite so impressive, because all that stuff's already happened. So it is important, if you're coming to the book and you're saying, this is prophecy, so it has to be early. Um, and the only people that do that are people that have theological commitments. Um, like, I'm sure, just to be clear, I'm sure that there are, like, I'm sure there's an atheist scholar out there, biblical scholar or something, that is saying, no, it can't be early, so I have to make it late. Like, in my experience, evangelical, more progressive Christian, uh, you know, anybody that's a biblical scholar, they're not coming to it trying to make it date a certain way, because it just doesn't matter. Their theological interpretations allow for it to be late, and it doesn't mean that they have to stop being a Christian. So,
No, 100% agree. And that's kind of how I look at it, where I'm like, okay, if I was a Christian, because I think about that sometimes, um, what would I think about it, or what would like change? And I don't know. I kind of feel like I said, I kind of already have more of an appreciation of the Bible. Um, but I feel like it wouldn't like change much. Like I would, like it'd just be like, okay, like it was written by people who got things wrong, who had
yeah,
biases, were propaganda, and were trying to push their own agendas of things and kind of tell the story, just like other um, cultures have been doing. So, but I wouldn't break, you know, like the Christianity or my belief in
yeah,
God or something like that if I were
that's right.
to do that. So, which is very interesting how strong, or like wanting to hold on to certain things rather than just admitting. I mean, like for example, like slavery in the Old Testament, just like, I don't know, I would just be like, yeah, they got it wrong. Like he,
Yeah, we're humans,
yeah,
like, it's what we do.
yeah.
Um,
And so, yeah,
so
so it's just more of like that. So I don't know. It's just like, well, is this a battle word? Not a battle. That's not the right word. But is it just like, what does
is
the
it a
text
hill worth
say?
dying on? Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know. To me, it's just like, well, yeah, they got it wrong. We're humans, and that's just kind of that's what they were doing to, just like every other people do. Whatever.
I just as a sort of a brief aside, but to sort of capitalize on this point, the last chapter in volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook, is "Did the Old Testament Plagiarize?" That's the title, and I'm essentially looking at, uh, e- what does it mean when scholars say Genesis 1 is dependent upon the Akkadian story, the Enuma Elish. Like, what does that mean? Or that the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9 is dependent upon the story of Atrahasis, or Gilgamesh Tablet 11. Like, what does that mean? What is this language of dependency? What's an illusion? What's an echo? what's a source text, what's a receptor text. So we go into uh, the terminology and how scholars talk about this, and we look at specifically Genesis 1 through 11, and we say, okay, like where are the connections between ancient Near Eastern mythology and Genesis 1 through 11, and what does that mean? Because there are a lot of fundamentalist evangelicals that would like throw a flag immediately and say, no, 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 no. Like the Bible doesn't take the flood story from Mesopotamia, right? They take it from the actual tradition of the flood coming down to them because there was a worldwide flood or a regional flood or whatever. Um, and then the Mesopotamian story is a corruption of it that's completely different, line of tradition. And it's like, yeah, why, why do we think that? And why does that matter so much to you? Because, and the example that I always like to use is if anybody listens to Eminem, right? When Eminem uses, and I can't remember which album it is, um, but he sings a song called "Remind Me," or he raps a song, whatever, and it utilizes uh, "I Love Rock and Roll" by Joan Jett. And I encourage everybody to go listen to it for two reasons. One, like he clearly is using Joan Jett, like voice and everything. The song interplays not only in meaning and phrases, individual phrases, but you actually hear the riffs, some of the riffs in the song. Um, does anybody like not appreciate Eminem anymore because he uses somebody's? No, of course not. In fact, it's part of the genius, right? People think, my God, look at how he used that and worked it in and made this new song and new thing. So it's actually it's not a diminishing thing that he's using it. It's a artistic brilliance, right? I like Eminem's music. But the other thing that is really important to recognize in this discussion about like borrowing and utilizing ancient texts and reworking them is that I did a little experiment almost accidentally where I wrote out the lyrics of both Joan Jett's song "I Love Rock and Roll" and Eminem's, and without the music, try it. Everybody go try it. You can probably just pull it up side by side on the internet. You would be hard pressed to say that they were one was utilizing the other. Hard pressed just from the lyrics because it's not apparent. You need that extra component of actually hearing it to hear how it's used. And of course, once you hear it, it's like, oh my God, of course he's using it. But if you just had the text, it'd be very difficult to pick up on that. And that's something to really pay attention to when we think about, you know, ancient Near Eastern texts borrowing from other ancient Near Eastern texts, because we don't have the music that often went along with it, right? Um, so we have to be careful that we're not missing that dimension
And it's like,
anyway ourselves.
the kind of what you have, then you just have to compare what's going on around the same time, like
Yeah,
what's being used and stuff like that. Um, I think probably what would essentially I think the problem, right, is going back to this kind of common theme of like the commitment, right? Of, well, if they are borrowing or if it was plagiarized, although I don't know, plagiarized would be an appropriate term because they wouldn't
I
have that, they wouldn't
yeah
have that term
I
back
talk
then.
about it in depth. I won't spoil what my conclusion is, but yeah, we talk about is it plagiarism? Is that the word that we should use to describe it, and why?
Yeah, and it would just like again, you would have to just structure, I guess, or I don't know, restructure some of your beliefs, or like, okay, well, maybe they did do that, and well, and it's kind of like, well, they did it for some reason, kind of like the way Eminem was like he wanted to do this or that, and so which
Yeah,
doesn't,
that's right.
yeah, and so okay, is there anything we want to hit before we kind of close out? Anything in particular?
Yeah. I mean, if you want me to, I can sort of run through the things that I talk about in the two volumes. If just brief overview of the books to see if people are interested in those topics. If you want me to do that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if slavery. I think I did find that chapter interesting because even though I read the book, I was like, okay,
Mhm.
what you add in it? It's fine. It's super interesting that you like the parallels between how you're always told, no, there it's not antebellum
Yeah.
slavery, it's different. And it's like, come on.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is owning people as property a problem? Yes or
yeah,
no?
yeah. I mean, this is. I'm to the point now. I talk about slavery so often in the Old Testament online, that when somebody says to me, "Well, why is slavery wrong?" The conversation's over. Like, it's in the same way that I'm not going to debate whether a trans person is a person, right?
Mhm,
Or a trans person should have rights. Like, I'm not debating that because that I think gives their argument way too much credibility. Like, it's done. I'm not arguing that. In the same way, if you have to ask me outside of a very specific like discussion about ethics and how we know about ethics, whatever, which I'm not the person to talk to about that anyway. It once you say, well, how do you even know slavery is wrong? We're done. We're, you know, that's the end of the conversation.
mhm.
But one of the things, as you say, that you hear all the time from Christian apologists is, well, it's let's just write here. What's his name? Frank Turek. I hear it from him all the time. Well, it's not, let's just get this out. It's not antebellum slavery. Or Mike Winger says the same thing, right? Yeah. Well, what they're doing in their minds is often what they're accusing atheists of doing, which is ironic to me. They're thinking about like the movies or what they've read in history books and what was actually done in
Mm,
the antebellum South.
yeah,
What they're not do, which was atrocious, by the
yeah,
way, just to be 100% clear on
mhm,
this, horrific. Which is why I argue about slavery so often. You'll hear why in a minute. Um, but the laws that were on the books in
mhm,
the antebellum South,
mhm,
completely different story.
mhm,
And when you compare the laws in the antebellum South to
mhm,
the laws in the Hebrew Bible, you're going to be surprised
yeah,
because the not only the laws themselves, but like the legal rationale behind them, what the judges were wrestling with is the same thing that they're wrestling with in the Old Testament, and that is masters have to be able to beat their slaves to get them to do their work, but they can't abuse or murder them. So, how do we have both of these things existing? What can we do with the law to make sure that they have the right to beat them, but they can't abuse or kill them? Like, people would be surprised. I've had several people tell me, like, whoa, like slaves had rights in the antebellum South. As far as the laws were concerned, of course, we know that that often, very, very often, did not in any way play out, right? And the same thing happens in the Old Testament. But the reason that I think this is so dangerous is that the arguments that Christian apologists make today to defend slavery in the Hebrew Bible, to try to make it say that it's not as bad as what it was, you could very easily make for the laws in the antebellum South,
yeah,
right? And because I've heard apologists do it, like, well,
mhm,
I mean, look, they weren't allowed to abuse them. Like, yeah, okay, so that they had to be able to do corporal punishment. How would you motivate them, right? But they had that, so but they couldn't it was against the law, right? And these servants, these bond servants, as they would like to say, like had rights, right? They had to they got the day off on the Sabbath, right? And they were given housing. And it's like, do you hear yourself? Like, is this thing on? Like, what? Um, so yes, I think it's incredibly dangerous because it's very easy to have it come back if you make those arguments
mhm,
and actually
mhm.
believe them.
And that's where, like, you go into, like like, I mean, yeah, I understand where it's like, okay, maybe they didn't. I mean, you can even grant, like, this is what I kinda like and what I appreciate. Like, you can grant, for whatever sake of argument, where maybe they did treat them differently. But like we're kind of going back to the law, the way it's structured when you compare them, it's kind of like they're using almost the same justification that's
Yeah.
being used to treat them this way or this or that way, whatever. So it's like, so where it is kind of, it is very similar. And so,
Yeah. I mean, if you think, and last thing I'll say about it, but if you think about Exodus 21, 20 to 21, I mean, that's the legal rationale. The thing that I
yeah.
just
Hmm.
described uh, in the antebellum South and what the judges were wrestling with, got to be able to beat them,
Hmm.
for corporal punishment to get them to be motivated, but you can't abuse or kill them.
No.
And if you did, I think it was in Virginia and several other states. But like if you did murder, it was determined that you murdered your slave. it would be as if you killed a free white person. The penalty would be as if you killed a free white person. Well,
Yeah.
that was shocking to me,
Oh,
because of course, we know that that's not what happened, right? I mean, it happened very, very infrequently, apparently. Um, but if you think about the legal rationale of Exodus 21:20-21, is if a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and they die, well, now it's assumed, like, that's the determining factor. They died immediately. Well, that must have been more than moderate correction, right? And so,
yeah.
and if you read through like Proverbs 29, you can see like, oh, okay, like it's they're encouraged uh to 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 beat their slaves and to beat their kids, right? Because that's how you motivate them, and train them and all these things. But then verse 21, but if he survives a day or two, then there's to be no punishment because he's his money. And this is the same thing that they're wrestling with. Well, you got to be able to beat them, got to be able to beat them, but you can't abuse them and you can't murder them. It's just, like, apologists, just pause and sit with that for a little while and think about what you're saying when you defend these practices in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, definitely. It just seems so obvious. At
Yes.
least, what I think that's the overall kind of big takeaway. Um, Moving on from the Old Testament, and sorry, slavery. In one of the chapters, um, one of the last chapters you have was the failed prophecy of Tyre, which I think is still, I don't know, it's not necessarily a hot topic or debate, but I know there are advocates out there that say, well, actually, it did happen, or the prophecy was fulfilled, but it's kind of in a different way. So you kind of, like, again, going back to this theme of like restructuring things a little bit. But anyway, if you want to kind of just go over a little bit of the prophecy and why it's failed, or what scholars kind of come
Yeah.
to consensus with.
So I'll open with a little anecdote. I have an evangelical friend that I went through Hopkins with, who's out of Tyndale, um, as a like one of their scholars and or their researchers, and he said, again, evangelical Christian. He held on to his faith all the way through our time at Hopkins, and he's like one of my best friends. And I saw him at one of our annual meetings, I think in 2018 or 19, I can't remember. And I was talking to him, having a cup of coffee, and he said, "Hey, so how's that YouTube channel doing? What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, actually, right now I just put a video series together, or a video together, a couple of videos together on the prophecy of Tyre in Ezekiel 26, because we had both taken the book of Ezekiel at Hopkins, translated through the whole thing." And he said, "Oh, why are you talking about that?" And I was like, "Oh, well, because like I'm having to talk about how it failed." And he said, "Like, what about it?" And I said, "Well, that it did, right? Nebuchadnezzar said, I mean, Ezekiel said that Nebuchadnezzar was going to take Tyre, and then he didn't." And he said, "Okay, well, what's the what's the upshot?" I said, "Yeah, there are people that say that it didn't happen that way." And it's his quizzical look, and he said, "Why?" So this is not something that I'm responding to, like, even evangelical scholarship. This is almost specifically to online apologists, right? These are the people that are making the arguments that, well, Tyre didn't actually happen the way that specifically their argument is that so in Ezekiel 26, Ezekiel says Tyre is going to be completely wiped off the map by the island city of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar, right? It says it's going to be like a rock that is scraped clean, right? And we know from history that it just didn't happen. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege for 13 years, never got in. The king of Tyre paid some tribute, and Nebuchadnezzar went home. Um, so then Ezekiel, 15 years after he makes the first prophecy in chapter 29, says, "Oh, the word of the Lord, right, has now come to me, and actually, um, Nebuchadnezzar worked really, really hard, but didn't get any pay from laying siege, and so God's going to give him Egypt instead," which also didn't happen. But uh, but it's a prophecy where he says X is going to happen, X doesn't happen, and then he says X didn't happen. It's one of the clearest examples of, a quote unquote failed prophecy. So evangelical scholars, like if you read Chris Udd, for example, he's got a really great article on this. He sort of goes through the arguments that people make that are just kind of untenable, I'll say. Um, and there have been online apologists that I've directly responded to about this. And so, for example, I won't mention names, but like, some people have made the argument that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the mainland city of Old Tyre, right, uh, for 13 years. And it took him that long to get in, but he didn't apparently lay siege all the way around the mainland city. Like that part in between, there's a shoreline, and he just didn't get his troops around that far for 13 years. I'm not sure, because the argument is that all the people of the mainland city of Old Tyre, it's actually, the city's called Ushu, um, like snuck out the back door and made their way to the island. And then finally Nebuchadnezzar got into the mainland city and went, "Hey, where'd they go?" And they took all their stuff and went up to the island, and they said, "Oh, this sucks," went home. Well, I mean, it's just a goofy argument. I'm sorry. Um, and so I actually address this not only from, looking at the literary structure of Ezekiel 26, and comparing it to other passages in Ezekiel and some in Jeremiah, and looking at some of these main arguments that apologists make about this chapter, and trying to say, for example, that Nebuchadnezzar was just supposed to be the first person to lay siege. But Alexander the Great, the person that actually did get in, building that causeway out to the island, that's the prophecy is actually mentioning him, just more subtly, right? So I deal with that. Is the prophecy about Alexander the Great? No, um, it's not. It's about Nebuchadnezzar, and that's it. But I go through all of that and then sort of deal with these arguments. But the last thing that I'll say, this is not a problem for evangelical scholars, because what they say, and again, I disagree with it, but it's a much more plausible explanation than some of these others. Um, they say that if you think about the city of Nineveh in the book of Jonah, Jonah goes and says 40 days and this city's going to be destroyed. Did the city get destroyed? No. Why? Because in the story, the people repented. Right. And this was sort of the point of prophecy, not only in the Old Testament, but in the ancient Near East. The prophets are doing things to try to get people to, in the Old Testament, to try to behave, right, as they see it. And so the idea that people like Chris Udd or Robert Chisholm, I think Chris Udd would make this argument. I don't remember actually, but certainly Robert Chisholm and other scholars would say, no, it's prophecy is inherently contingent. So when when Ezekiel said to the island city of Tyre, Nebuchadnezzar is going to wipe you out, that the, when the king repented, however he did, that God changed his mind and said, okay, I'm gonna let you survive. So that's how they engage with it. They don't engage with it by saying it's actually about Alexander. Or it's no, they say it's a contingent prophecy. Um, Again, I disagree with that conclusion for a number of reasons, but it's much more plausible and a better argument than some of the others.
Yeah. Perfect. Just kind of in a way of kind of wrapping up a little bit. If you don't mind, kind of telling everyone or telling the listeners what maybe they can expect from Volume 2, or some of the topics that you kind of further address in the book 2, and then we can kind of conclude from there.
Okay, sounds great. So there in each volume there's three background chapters that are more general in nature, and then there are four sort of hot button issues. Volume 2 actually gives you 5, because in the archaeology chapter I deal with not just archaeology but with an actual hot button topic. So it's about the conquest. and we talked about it earlier, but like, is there evidence, archaeological evidence, for the conquest? And if not, what is it that scholars say? Um, like, where did early Israel, actually come from? And just very briefly, the position of scholars today is that the Israelites that populated the highlands in the 12th, late 13th, 12th centuries, sorts of that time period there in end of the late Bronze Age, Iron One, is they're Canaanites, right? They're people that were in Canaan already, most of them. So that's the hot button issue in chapter 3. Chapter 4 deals with the Exodus. Is it myth or history or somewhere in between? We talk about the dating, the different dating ideas. What is it that we can actually say about the Exodus? And again, for both of those chapters, I had Egyptologists and archaeologists, prominent in the field, read through it. So I feel good about it, because Egyptology is not my area of expertise, and certainly archaeology is not. It's a little more, but certainly not. I didn't comprehensive examine it or something. Anyway, then chapter 5 is dealing with divine commands of violence and genocide. So if you've ever heard a Christian apologist say, like, oh, well, the reason that God wiped out the Canaanites in the book of Joshua, or people that were in the land, is because they were really, really wicked. We deal with that apologetic argument. The other one that you hear all the time is that, oh, no, it's just hyperbole, right? Or ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. So we deal with that. We look at, is there ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric, and how does it actually work? And does it work in these really important passages? Then chapter 6 is looking at sex crimes. So I look at specifically what was adultery and what was rape in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible, and I make a comparison between the law collections that talk about those things. So we end up dealing with that really important passage in Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29, where it says, if a man seizes an unbetrothed virgin in the field and lies with her, and they are found, he's not killed as a penalty for raping her. He has to pay the father 50 shekels of silver. I think it's 50 shekels. Can't remember off the top of my head, but might be 100. I think it's 50. Anyway, sorry, I haven't looked at the passage in several weeks, but he has to marry her, and he can never divorce her if the father. Yeah. Anyway, but the point is that he's not killed, right? And there's no consent on the part of the daughter. It's just she marries the rapist, right? And so there's a big debate about, well, the word that seize in verse 28, does it really mean to seize, like to grab hold of and restrain? Or does it mean like to seize, like to embrace, to give them a hug, and the argument then is, well, maybe it just means like to hug them or to kiss them or whatever, and it's consensual. And so it's not actually rape. Now it's just two crazy kids. They're in love and they don't follow the rules, and so now they have to get married, right? Well, that makes it a lot better from a moral standpoint, but yeah, it's not. It's rape. It's rape. So I deal with all of that. And then finally in chapter 7, I talk about, did the Old Testament plagiarize? So we address things like, what is plagiarism? Is that an appropriate term to use? We look at ancient Near Eastern examples outside of the Bible where they utilize earlier texts and rework them. And then we talk about how Genesis 1 through 11 utilizes ancient Near Eastern mythology to do something new and to respond to stories and myths in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on there. I can't wait to read it. Definitely have to have you back on to talk about that again.
Awesome.
And I think you said there's a 3rd volume coming out too. So
yeah, I mean, I haven't. I guess I've started it, but that one is probably going to be a little while. I'm going to write a second updated edition to Did the Old Testament Endure Slavery? That's my next project.
Okay.
So it's going to be a lot thicker, the book, because one of the things that, as you might imagine, has happened is that some of these really, really bad and easy to knock down apologetic arguments on slavery aren't coming up as often anymore. But now, as I like to call them, apologists are throwing throw it up against the wall and see if it sticks arguments at me, and at other people online. And so, like, oh, well, what about this one? And then you take all this time to respond to it thoroughly, and they go, yeah, 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 but what about this one? And so it's just, yeah. So there's a lot more now that has to go in the book. I'm going to develop it more from, if you've read it, the audience has read it. Like, there's going to be a lot more in ancient Near Eastern law. We're going to talk about other aspects of ancient Near Eastern slavery that I didn't deal with in the first edition. So it should be good, but that'll be the next thing to come out.
Very cool. Before we close out, where can people find you? And yeah, if they want to get in contact or just see some of your work that you guys do for your channel, yeah. But
Yeah, all the books are on Amazon. If you just search on Joshua Bowen, Bowen, all the books will come up that we've written. We are at Digital Hammurabi, Hammurabi, like the old Babylonian king in the 18th century BCE. Yeah, we've got a YouTube channel. Megan and I are both on Twitter. Of course, my wife is smarter than I am. She's also an Assyriologist from Hopkins, but she's really the brains behind this whole operation. And she's better looking too, like easy on the eyes. You know what I mean? But yeah, she runs a scholarship program for PhD students called Humans Against Poor Scholarship, where uh, it's a nonprofit organization that gives $2,000 scholarships to students to try to get them through the summer when they don't have funding. And so I think she was able to give 4 $2,000 scholarships away this past summer or past spring, and it's all crowdfunded, right? All our supporters. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, please take a look. Digital Hammurabi. We have a website, digitalhammurabi.com. All that stuff's up there. So,
perfect. All that will be definitely in the links in the description, so everyone go check that
oh,
out,
thank you.
check them out, and support them. And yeah, Dr. Josh, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a blast.
And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time.